Hi, welcome to Kalkona Cricket Cast. I'm your host, Pratham, and today we're shifting our focus away from the cricketing action in the subcontinent to the cricket about to be played in the antipodes. A couple of days back, we were previewing Bangladesh versus India. Today, we'll be previewing a clash between Australia and South Africa. I'm glad to be joined by an Australian mate of mine in covering this, Icarus. You can find him sharing his takes on Twitter at the handle Teril Kung. So mate, I'll leave the floor to you for a bit, and there are two important questions I wanted to mainly ask you about here. One, what do you seek in an Australia versus South Africa series? And B, why do you care about the series? Because I'm curious to get your thoughts, before we dive into this, I'm curious to get your thoughts for what's making you stoked to watch the series.
Okay, so my first reason has to do with the general style of cricket played between these two teams historically. I think generally contests between these two teams involving countries which have like the best pace attacks in the world facing up against batsmen who are in theory and often in practice like most accustomed to playing bounce and pace. I think there's something like really high octane and exciting about seeing like a top pacer duel against a batsman and they're not afraid to play all these shots against like that style of bowling, especially when it's like aimed at their throat.
Yeah, I mean, to that point actually, just a brief reaction. And, you know, some of my most memorable like moments watching cricket being played, from watching footage of cricket being played in the 90s actually involves South Africa Australian contests, and often, you know, the battles between Donald and Steve Waugh, for example, Stain in 2008 and so forth. So there's a rich tradition of some really high quality fast bowling paired up against some of the best batsmen in the world that are equipped to be dealing with that sort of bowling. So it's a really fascinating prospect. But yeah, sorry, please go ahead.
And also the second reason has to do with the competitiveness, like the one-on-one duels. Since the turn of the millennium, across like 11 series played between Australia and South Africa, I think each side has only lost twice in each other's backyard. Australia has only lost to South Africa only recently in 2018, the infamous Sandpaper Gate series.
Right.
And South Africa has only lost in Australia in 2001 and 2006. They basically won everything from 2008 onwards. While there's a lot to delve into the history of encounter, what's significant here is that both of these sides are unusually competitive away from home. It's especially relevant for South Africa given that they basically have the best record win series in Australia of any national team since the 1990s. It kind of makes these encounters much more exciting because they truly do seem to be more competitive than other sides coming to these shores besides India nowadays. And finally, perhaps the most relevant part to the specific series, in the context of today, both sides have really high stakes entering into the series. Even though both Australia and South Africa are up in the World Test Championship rankings, both of them obviously want to do really well in this series so they can feel assured they have like a genuine shot at qualifying for the final. Because I think Australia playing in India next year, and it's pretty unlikely.
It's a four-match test series. Yeah,
it's pretty unlikely they're gonna even win the series, let alone win a single test there. I don't have much high hopes for that, but they still need, so in the meantime they still need to win as much as possible, like at least like a whitewash 3-win sweep to ensure qualification, so they won't have to rely on like any results in India. And comparing with South Africa, they need like at least 4 wins to safely secure their slot into the final. Their path looks pretty favourable for the next assignment. They have like a 2-match series against West Indies afterwards. Even if their chances of whitewashing the Windies, West Indies are pretty high, they still need to at least win a match in Australia to confirm a top 2 finish. So yeah, so just winning this series just makes their like qualifications even more likely.
So now let's move away from talking about our motivations for covering the series and talk about factors that are going to affect the series itself. And I think there's no better place to start than actually talking about where the series is going to be held. Because there are 3 places it's going to be held at. There's 3 tests in total. There's the first test, which is going to be held at the venue, the Gabba, in Brisbane, and the second test will be at the MCG, and then the third test will be at the SCG. And the first thing I really want to just bring up about them, these surfaces, these places, that is really interesting to me, I should say, are the pitches. Because one of the most important things that affects the state of play in cricket, by far, in most estimation, is the state of the pitches. Especially in Test match cricket, where they can constantly evolve, and how they change is very much a function of how different teams end up playing. So, in terms of the pitches likely to be seen in Brisbane and Melbourne for the series, I'd say it's important to take a look at the surfaces that have been used there since 2018. Because this was exactly around the time two individuals were newly appointed to assume the responsibility of preparing wickets at the Gabba and the MCG. I'm talking about here David Sanderski and Matt Page. Now, they have had a history of being in the system for a while. They've produced especially in the case of Matt Page, he worked at the WACA for a while, producing and at Perth in general, at the Optus Stadium, producing some pitches from my understanding. So it's not like these were out of the blue assignments, but they mattered because curators really have a pretty big say on how a game pans out because of the state of the pitch. And while curators aren't always able to create wickets they want due to factors sometimes out of their control, like weather sometimes ruins their plans. They want to prepare a wicket and it's rainy, so they can't do it. We've seen that happen a lot of the time. These curators, they're still often able to prepare wickets with certain characteristics they like if they're competent. And Sanderski and Page, I would say, by far, are competent curators who have often been very expressive and describe the sorts of characteristics they want to see in the pitches they produce. And you can tell that because since their arrival, you can actually tell and see a change in the pitches. For reference, just compare the wickets prepared before their arrival in 2018 to the ones served up before. In the half-decade before Sanderski became the Gabba's permanent groundsman, the Gabba produced only 1 out of 5 pitches that could be considered anything apart from flattish and slow. And that test that we're talking about is the 2013 Ashes test. Marcojansen, as you might recall, Icarus, had a very fun time on that pitch. he dearly exploited the additional bounce to take a 9-4 on it. So it's not like they didn't have any surfaces like that, but 1 out of 5, that's not a very good ratio, is it? And so, following the departure of the previous caretaker, who was at the ground, he took over from his father, actually, a guy by the name of Kevin Mitchell Jr. Sanderski came into the role, and he appears to have tried to improve the surface in some ways. In particular, he seems to have wanted to revert the Gabba to its traditional reputation of being one of the bounciest and paciest wickets in Australia. And this has, come to pass, but it's not always the boon that bowlers might think it is. Because even though the wickets themselves have good bounce, carry, and pace for the quicks and spinners alike, it hasn't always translated into actual movement off the pitch. And one feature that I've seen in recent times, 2018 onwards, in a lot of the surfaces that have been played at the Gabba, the wickets themselves haven't deteriorated that much. So, just for example, right, we saw India famously chase down 329 in the 2021 Border Gavaskar Trophy, and we even saw England, who were having about as abysmal of a time with a bat in their last Ashes series here down under. They were able to, put up their notoriously poor batting lineup, was able to put up nearly 300 to salvage an innings defeat. So it isn't always the bowler's paradise that one might assume, given the general gist of the changes I'm describing here. But still, there does tend to be sufficient help for the quicks early on because the pitch starts out slightly greener especially in recent times from what I can tell, on day one. And then it transitions later on in the match to sort of offer some assistance for the spinners as it dries out, without actually deteriorating. And it's not only the wicket in Brisbane that I'm talking about here, because this sort of contrast, right, before and after, you see it even happen in even more stark proportions at Melbourne, because between 2012 and 2017, 4 of the 5 matches that were hosted at the MCG, they were played on surfaces that one, in all reasonable, being very reasonable here, could classify as sluggish, slow, and flat. And you only had one odd one out, and it was the earliest of the lot in 2012. It was a test back versus Sri Lanka, where it was slightly bouncy. It didn't really offer anything in terms of movement off the deck, though, and it really took some decent bowling from Jackson Bird and Mitchell Johnson with their pace to prize out the wickets against what was a pretty weak Sri Lankan batting lineup at that stage for the most part. And yeah, I mean the wicket in all the other 4 matches I'm mentioning, it's been, the pitches, they've been pretty lifeless, to the point where the one in 2017, Icarus, mate, you might remember this. Alistair Cook might have given you some nightmares about this one. It was so bad. It was so bad that he made 246, and he didn't look like he was going to buy a run the entire time around. He ended up making 246, and it was such a bad wicket, to put it politely, that it was penalized with a low rating by the ICC. And as you can tell, that matters a lot, right? Because if you get into an issue with the ICC, right, if you get a below average rating or even a poor rating, right, your surface could be barred from playing Test cricket for a pretty long period of time. So as a response to the heartless wickets that were prepared in the past like that, especially, the new creator who came in, Matt Page, he's tried to inject a lot more life into the wickets. And what he's done to do that is he's made the wickets a lot more firmer. I think they replaced the pitch as well in 2020, 2021 as well. So that the previous drop-in, I think. So that's something that they've tried to nurse those pitches and put them in place. And even though these wickets have been hard, one of the interesting things about them is that they've had some moisture underneath and live green grass left on them. And what that's meant is really since, I would say, the 2019 New Zealand Test, the MCG pitch has pitches that have been prepared. They've often sported a very verdant look to them. And that's translated to pretty good seam movement for the quicks and carry as well. But because of that little bit of moisture that's in the surface, and the MCG Melbourne tends to have sometimes a little bit of unpredictable weather, where things can dry out, especially due to rain in some cases and not as consistently. There has been a tendency, because of that extra moisture left in, from what I've noticed, that the bounce there that you get is a bit spongy. And we saw this even in the Pakistan versus India World Cup game, the T20 World Cup game this year as well. So
so not just in recent years where it's been offering some more help to like the paces with the movement carries. Actually, the pitch actually helped provide some assistance to the spinners as well, because
that's true.
I think there's like a recent Crick Buzz feature in regards to Steve Smith, and he mentioned how that during the 2021 Border Gavaskar series in the MCG test, he was he was actually surprised that the ball that he got out to Ashwin in MCG. He said that he didn't actually expect the ball to be spinning as much as it did there, and the bounce that Ashwin got, basically comparing to previous years, because you don't really normally experience that in Australia that much. You can just kind of sit back and just wait on it. So so that's what Steve Smith has observed in recent years.
I think it's a really valid point. I mean, I observe, when I was watching that match, I observed that it was very helpful to bowlers of all stripes. And man, I want to go on a trip down memory lane, but it brings back very fond memories as somebody from who's an Indian cricket team supporter to some extent, watching Ajinkya Rahane make a very fine 100 on that. So
let's not talk about that.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. but yeah, coming back to this. In coming back to the series itself, right, that's about to take place, I think that you're going to see wickets that are prepared at the Gabba and the MCG, or the G, as some people call it, from my understanding in Australia. Might be incorrect here, but I've heard that abbreviation. I get the sense that those wickets those style of wickets that I mentioned that have been happening in recent times, they're also going to emerge here as well. And that is to say, the Gabba is going to be slightly green. It's going to be bouncy. It's not going to deteriorate much in the back end of the game, but it'll offer a little bit more help for the spinners as the game goes on. And then the MCG, I reckon, is going to be a green top. You're going to get a lot of nice movement and carry and bounce and so forth, but it's also going to be one of those wickets where the odd ball isn't going to behave predictably, because one ball is going to come in slightly slower, one ball is going to come in a little bit quicker. The bounce might not be as consistent. But yeah, so I think those are going to be that's going to be the state of the pitches for those first two test matches. If we go to the third test match, which is at the SCG, I'd say despite its yesteryear reputation as a dry surface turning from day one and crumbling onwards, I don't think that's actually that reputation I don't think is earned in recent times, because I think it's going to be a very flat wicket for this upcoming third test. If you, again, just look at the last 5 years, 3 of the 6 test matches held at this venue have been drawn, right? And in a couple of those, Australia have had to fight till the last session to force a win on what were pretty batting friendly surfaces otherwise. And yeah, I mean, I think that the one nice thing about the wicket at the SCG in recent times, compared to some of the wickets even a couple of years back that I've observed, is that there does tend to be a little bit more bounce in recent times there than it was, say, during the mid 2010s, and we saw that in the last Ashes series as well, right? And it's interesting in both ways, right? Because it does help the spinners who put overspin on the ball, or bowl with overspin, or get overspin, I should say. And it can help the tall pacers because you can get more bounce, right? And it can be nice to them to some extent. But because of the wicket's pretty even from what I can tell, you're going to also give the opportunity for batsmen to score at a much quicker rate. And I think the most prime example of this in recent times was when Johnny Bairstow counterattacked and scored that century, his comeback of sorts into the Test team as of late. He scored a very quick 100. He smashed an off-color Lyon and Cummins to some extent in that match. And so I think that it's one of those venues where you are going to get high totals, even though there is some bounce on offer for the bowlers.
Yeah,
but
valuing for your shots.
Yeah. And actually, speaking of value of your shots, right? I think that quicker rate of scoring, it's going to be encouraged by the fair amount of bounce there at the SCG. It's also going to be helped by the outfield, right? Because the at least in modern matches that I've seen there, the grass tends to be trimmed up pretty well. The ground staff do a really good job of taking care of the wicket and the outfield and so forth, and the underlying soil there. I remember the SCG, like a lot of other grounds, it gets used for different things. I think some AFL games also take place there. I might be wrong, but I think that happens as well. And one of the things that I've noticed a lot of sportsmen who've played there in general, when they've been talking about the outfield, is that it's a very hard outfield. And so the combination of there not being a lot of grass and it being a very hard outfield, the hard soil underneath in terms of the outfield, I think you're going to get a situation where shots are going to rocket to the fence, right? So you as you said, value for shots I think is very likely. And I would say particularly if you place strokes towards the shorter side of the boundaries, batsmen are probably going to be a little bit more enthused by taking that route, because the boundaries on the square sides of the wicket or I should say the boundaries in the square sides of the wicket are pretty short compared to the down the wicket essentially. And it's interesting that I say that, actually, because the opposite is going to be the case for the MCG, because the MCG is pretty much the biggest ground in the world, I'd say, in terms of playing dimensions. And what that does is that because you have such a comparatively massive size of the ground, you have very big boundaries in general, and you have extremely big boundaries that are square of the wicket. And so, your pulls, your cuts aren't necessarily going to instantly go to the fence, I would say. Even though they might travel fast, it's much more likely for a fielder to intercept them. But when you're playing down the wicket, the boundaries are much shorter. So aggressive, batsmen who want to play that sort of, who want to enjoy that stroke play, the full reward for that stroke play, are probably going to find it a safer bet to play down the wicket.
Yeah, playing through the V.
Yeah, playing through the V, man. Love that expression in cricket. But yeah, in contrast to both, I would say that the first test match, though, which is going to be held at the Gabba, at least what I've seen of the Wilton Gabba cricket ground, is that its dimensions, compared to a lot of other Aussie venues like Adelaide, like MCG, like Sydney, it's a bit shorter. It's not that big of a ground, and so it's in general, I'd expect more boundaries to be scored there. All things equal. I will say, though, just because it's a smallish ground by Australian standards doesn't make it a small ground. A lot of South African venues...
it's still bigger than most grounds compared to the rest of the world.
Yeah. And especially in South Africa, man. I mean, they don't have, that huge venues from what I can tell, right? So, in a lot of cases. So, I mean, Dean Elgin might not be, and his men might not be quite accustomed to that, but that that is something to make a note of. What I like about this, what I like about what is expected here, I should say, is that the conditions that are expected to arise are probably going to be very conducive for a more, I would say, quote unquote, exciting brand of cricket to be played for the spectator. And just for viewing, right? In general, for even the TV audience outside of the ground. Unfortunately, I think the one thing that could sort of derail that a little bit is the fact that the weather might spoil such potentially riveting encounters from fully taking place, because it's expected to stay overcast for a good period of the Gabba test, and the forecast so far has shown rain on several days during the test matches, especially in the localities where the MCG and SCG lie. So that's a bit of a bummer, but I think all in all, we're likely to get some pretty good cricket thanks to, in part, I should say, the surfaces that are going to be offered and the grounds that we're going to get to see the matches being played at. So let's turn our attention now away from the actual venues and places where these matches are going to be held and talk about the actual people who are going to partake in them. That is to say, let's talk about the squads that have been selected for this particular series. And I'm going to start here with Australia, actually, because they go into the series with a pretty stable squad, I would say, for the most part. There are next to no new faces in their setup, and this largely makes sense, right? Their previous series at home was versus the West Indies. They ended up thrashing the West Indies pretty thoroughly, you would say. I mean, when you bowl a side out for 77 in the final innings, it's not it's not exactly what you would call and they end up losing by a significant margin too, right? On what was not a particularly hostile pitch. Yeah, you can say that's a thrashing in most respects. So they clean sweeped against the West Indies at home 2-0, and given that in that match it was the backup bowling options like Scott Boland and Michael Nisa who reaped the wicket-taking rewards for their opening spells, in general the squad makes a lot of sense. But mate, would you like to actually play?
Yeah, in terms of listing Australia's actual squad for the first test, it's basically, from familiar faces, as we all know, like Pat Cummins, Scott Boland, Alex Carey, Cameron Green, Marcus Harris, Travis Head, Usman Khawaja, Marnus Labuschagne, Nathan Lyon, Lance Morris, Michael Neser, Steve Smith, Mitchell Starc, David Warner. With Pat Cummins, he's returning for the Gabba Test opener after missing out in the last test due to quad injury. Hazelwood is the missing name. He has a recent injury with his side strain that's forced him out. It's kind of like a similar reoccurring injury from last year's Ashes.
I remember that.
Yeah. Recent bowling additions to the squad to cover for Cummins and Hazelwood's injuries during the West Indies series are Michael Neser and Lance Morris. And I know you are very excited to talk about Lance Morris, so I'll let the floor is yours.
Yeah. I was gonna say, right, that there is, I mentioned earlier that there's next to no new faces in the squad, and the reason why I said next to no was because there is an exception to that rule, however, and it's one that I am very excited to see, right? So the 25-year-old Western Australian speedster, Lance Morris, he's in, and he's on the back of what I would say mainly performances in the last season and a half. I think it's fair to say that. They have been very promising performances, though, and in particular, he in the 2021 domestic 4-day Sheffield Shield competition, he ended up taking 20 wickets in 8 matches at an average of 27, which is pretty good. But this year around, he one-upped himself. He really upped those exhibitions of fast bowling because he took 7 more wickets than last year, so 27 wickets. And the Shield season's still kind of going on, but he in 3 fewer matches, he only played 5 this time as opposed to the 8 last time. He's taken those 27 wickets in, which is pretty. that's a pretty good tally of hope. If you ask your captain, hey, I'm gonna get you like 5 wickets a match, generally they'll be like, yeah, that's good in a 4-day game. But I want to actually talk about those exhibitions of fast bowling, as I mentioned earlier. I use the term there very, very much because they've been really some sight to see, right? And one of those exhibitions came in the first match of the season itself, because he ended up blasting out 9 wickets against a pretty reasonable first-class New South Wales batting lineup. I know they're missing some of their key players, right? They're missing, your Steve Smiths and a bunch of your like full-time Test players, but they still had some foreign, they had some international batsmen who have represented Australia at the international level, right? Curtis Patterson and Moses Enriques. I never know how to pronounce that, by the way. Icarus, do you have an idea?
No.
Fair enough. But I mean, the point being, right? Like those two have played for Australia before. I know Enriques was in the side mainly as an all-rounder, and he didn't have exactly what you'd call the best Test, average as a batsman. But it's what I'm trying to get at is this is not just a bunch of random nobodies, right? There are a couple of players here that are either in line for the selection radar, or at the very least have been under the national selectors' radars, and he pretty much blasted through them very, very very easily. And I want to take a backseat here, back from talking about the statistics at large, because one of the things that sort of has caught the eye of the selectors and caught my attention as well, right, mate, is the pace that he's generated in those matches. And there have been better bowlers in domestic with better domestic records, obviously, that are played for Australia. Some of them are in the squad and are probably gonna play like Boland and Neser. But Lance Morris has something that probably no other bowler in Australia that I've seen so far has, and that is the gift of added pace, because I think he just might be the far quickest bowler that we've seen in Australia for a long time. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples here, right? So in the very first over of a Shield match that I ended up watching a bit of, he clocked twice at 152 kilometers per hour. And if you think this is a one-off, don't, because he clocked 153 kilometers in a 4-day game before that as well, and then he clocked 151 in a Big Bash match. So you're starting to see the guy can hit 150 pretty regularly. That's not that puts you in the bracket of genuine pace. And even in a game against Victoria just earlier this season, he was timed at 148 kilometers per hour, and it wasn't a one-off there either. He was repeatedly near the 150 mark in that match. But we've seen express bowlers or really quick bowlers burst on the scene, and one of the issues that they often end up finding themselves in is that they don't think that they're able to sustain those speeds over the course of a day's play, and so they struggle to do that, right? And their performances drop because of that. And it comes to like the reason why that's important, right? Is it is very important for you to be able to have the stamina to last a work day or for a bowler, because you're not going to quite get always receptive surfaces for you. You're going to have to often work very hard on them. And one of the greatest bowlers from Australia of all time, fast bowlers, Dennis Lilly, one of the things that was said by the people who watched him that praised him a lot, and one of the things you can notice when you go back and watch the footage as well, is that very often he would bowl just as quick at 4 p.m. at the end of the third session on a day's play as the very start of the test match, for test match day's play. And so it's considered a hallmark of a genuinely great fast bowler, right? Being able to bowl flat out throughout the day, when the situations demand it, or being able to power through that if possible. And Morris certainly seems to have that quality in spades, because there are reports of him clocking 147 kilometers per hour well into the 30th over of a Shield game, right? I mean, I know that I'm including both innings here, but still, if you're clocking 147 and it's like over 15 in an innings, right? That gives you an indication that the guy can actually, he can actually bowl quick, and it's not just a matter of him bowling that way. And I mean, he has his teammates, Hilton Cartwright being one of them, talks about how the guy can be bowled as a workhorse. He has the ability to bowl very long spells, and that's a very good thing. And you can see the effect of that on Shield batsmen as well, right? Because he had a bumper that hit. There's a Tassie batsman, Lawrence Neil Smith, and he bowled a bounce at him and made him leave the field concussed. And then I saw Marnus Labuschagne. Now, Marnus Labuschagne is officially the world's highest ranked test batsman, right? And I saw him being done for sheer pace out LBW in one of the Shield games as well. And the other thing is he's got a certain degree of skill as well, executing some deliveries of different lengths. And what comes into my mind immediately is the Yorker, because I remember the New South Wales wicketkeeper, Baxter Holt. It was in the match where he took a 9 for in. He bowled this Yorker, and it just seemed to dip slightly at the last moment, and it cleaned him up completely. And before he could get his bat down, just bowled, right? So he's got a lot of raw potential, is what I'm trying to say. But despite all that, I think he's going to sit out of the series, because his average this season, if we're being honest, has been helped by the pitches. The opening match where he took a 9 for came on a grassy and unpredictable surface, and the economy rate is a bit concerning. In both seasons combined, he concedes about 3.5 runs per over. But the main reason why he's probably going to sit out is actually because of the strength of Australia's bowling attack. I mean, you've got Cummins. He's technically a replacement of a Cummins who was having injury, that strain that you mentioned, that was why he was absent for the second test versus the West Indies. And given that Cummins appears to be recovering well and is just about the best test bowler in the world, it's really hard to see Morris get a go. But I just find it a very fascinating thing that he's there. I think it's right to call him up in the squad, and I think he'll develop his repertoire of skills more as a quick bowler under the guidance of somebody like a Cummins or Starc.
Yeah, so I know you've been really excited about the prospect of Lance Morris. I guess not to try to play devil's advocate. I guess I'm erring more on the cynical side, or I would say being pessimistic on the rising spotlight of Lance Morris. I mean, I think in general, when it comes to like out and out fast bowlers in the cricketing world, I think the cricketing public tends to be a bit of a mythos or a mythology, or I would say like a certain bias when it comes to seeing anyone that can bowl really rapid and quick. I think for me, I think just how quickly like Lance Morris has like fast tracked into the Australian cricketing squad. I think I wouldn't say it's unwarranted, but I do think that I think the recent rise of Lance Morris, it's only been like one or so Sheffield season. And I think it's a bit unfair given in terms of our Australians' current fast bowling stocks, where in terms of like the pecking order, I would say that in my opinion, I would say he's still behind the pecking order compared to the likes of Mark Steckity, Joe Paris, and the ones that's already in the squad like Michael Nisa and Scott Boland, because they're the ones that have been providing consistent production in domestics for the last few years or so, and I still see them as ahead of Lance Morris, and given how
I can understand that. Yeah, I can understand that.
And given with I mean like the fast tracking of like fast bowlers into Australian system, it's nothing like it's nothing new before, because in the past, and I think I'm trying to make like a comparison, how I see Lance Morris, I think he's still below in terms of the hype and the skills into how Pat Cummins first gets fast tracked into the system. Yeah, in the 2011 series. I think same with Jai Richardson ahead of the squad when he got picked up during the 2018 series, and I think unlike those two, when you see them rise up to the system, you kind of see that it wasn't just like raw pace that they had that was in their favor. I think they were mainly picked because in Cummins' earlier years he had an actual an actual outswing, while Jai Richardson he had some actual swinging skills. And I think with Lance Morris, I think he's still a bit too much he's still a little too raw, and I think he'll still need some time before he's developed like other skills, because I think with just the pace he's got, he's still, I would say, a bit more like a one-dimensional. And I think how the cricketing discourse with how people see just raw pace as the end or be all, and that's what matters. I think that bias tends to be like kind of like overshadow everything else.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. There are a lot of great bowlers that weren't of a particularly quick pace that kind of get outshadowed sometimes because they're not as thrilling to watch to some in the eyes of some, right? But they might be more skillful. I wanted to ask you actually. So do you think that the way I perceive it is that for all intents and purposes, at least, he's going to be, for the most part, be used as a net bowler. Do you think that's
I think they're just going to bring him up to the squad just to purely prepare, like, just because the pace Lance Morris offers. I think they're just going to use him purely as like a net bowler to prepare for like the South African bowling quicks.
Makes sense.
That's how I see it. And I think he'll provide a good preparation. And I think even with like other like pace bowlers rising up to the Australian domestic system, you can see someone like Riley Meredith. He was also very raw, but there's been a recent article with Riley Meredith and how he's been, and his bowling philosophy is that he's kind of realizing the concept of like bowling in gears rather not, because you mentioned about the fact of sustaining pace throughout the whole day. I think Riley Meredith now, he kind of realized that, kind of similar, he kind of like been inspired with how Dale Steyn bowls, where he doesn't bowl full tilt all the way through. He knows.
Yeah, I was going to mention that when you said that. I was thinking that.
yeah, because Meredith has like realized how there's certain periods of the day, or against certain spells, or against certain batters, in order when to properly channel that pace, rather than just be a bit more smart about it.
Yeah, and just a quick interjection here to just sort of belabor your point. It's the fact that, like, Steyn, for example, right? He knew that he could maximize the amount of new ball outswing, and if an often late outswing that he could get if he bowled a little bit slower, around say 135 clicks, 137 clicks, right? Just a bit shy of the 85 mile per hour mark, and then when the ball would stop, getting When the ball would be such where he would stop getting much new ball movement, right? The ball would get old and so forth. That's when he would sort of ramp up the pace and bowl 8 to 10 kilometers on average faster. In several matches I've seen something to that effect, and so I think it's a really interesting point you make. You brought up South Africa's bowling attack and Lance Morris potentially being used as a method of preparation for their bowlers. I actually want to turn now to South Africa. And South Africa, on the other hand, their squad isn't as settled, and you can expect that because they lost a series to England, and so they've made some changes after that. The biggest of them is Aiden Markram. He's gone from the side. I don't think it's a surprise. In the last 9 tests that he's played, he's failed to make a 50 more than once, right? And this is despite being shuffled down the order to sort of protect him from the new ball. So I expected that, but I know you have a take on his exclusion that was really interesting. So
yeah. So I think the South Africa's choice in dropping Aiden Markram is completely fair and logical in terms of actual production because he's not been making the runs. And in terms of Aiden Markram's career, he had a really good start to his career, like his early trajectory. But I think the last few years he's just been, I think kind of coinciding on his like weird ODI trajectory where you would think with his talent he would be someone that would average easily over 40, but he just hasn't been making the runs. I think Markram has struggled, but I think this is probably a bit biased coming from an Australian perspective, but when I last saw Aiden Markram in the 2018 South Africa-Australia series, he looked like a really good talent. I think someone like him, like just from looking at the eye, and he'll be someone where I'm kind of relieved or glad that he's not in the squad because I can definitely see him with his potentials, someone that could actually like do well in Australia. Because I always fear the scenario where Markram was not making the runs in other test series, and then in this upcoming series, this is like the series that could like kickstart or revive his career. Because I think seeing how the way Markram batted in the 2018 series, I think it was very vivid to me because he was like one of the very few batsmen that was able to get on top with Josh Hazlewood's natural channel length outside off stump. He was able to ride on top of Hazlewood's bounce really well, and he was able to really like easily like cover drive Hazlewood to the boundary off that length. And usually that's very tough to do, especially given Hazlewood's natural bounce and someone like who can like easily like take on or equipped to handle that pace and bounce. I think that kind of skill set you would think that would actually be really suited in Australian conditions and pitches. So just the memories of seeing Markram's stroke play and cover drive and how comfortable he looked on the lengths and bouncing balls. I'm kind of relieved that he's actually not in the squad because I think he could have done really well. So yeah.
No, I understand that. I mean, I was incredibly impressed during that series with him as well. And he seems to, he was having struggles with spin, but he actually did play line better on in that second 100, I think, that he made in the series. Because he made 200s from my recollection. Because he struggled initially with him, then started using his feet a lot more. And you thought that, his biggest issue was like playing spin, right? And when he made that 100 in Rawalpindi, you got the impression that he might have cracked the code, but yeah, since then it's been kind of a step backward. There've been some technical flaws that have cropped up into his batting, I would say, and yeah, I get that, right? I do like Aiden Markram. I think he's a very talented young player. I think he has also ability to score very quickly without trying, and what I mean by that is he has an ability to rotate the strike and very quickly and also make boundary opportunities off balls like you were mentioning with Hazlewood, right? Deliveries that you wouldn't expect to be cover driven can be cover driven, and I remember him earlier on in his career like racing to 80, 70, 90, those sort of things for not too many deliveries at the cost of not too many deliveries. So yeah, I think it is a sad I would say, but in this case, given the set of performances, justified. I think the other person that had a lot of sort of hype was built around, and promise was shown at, that's also sort of made the axing, or made the cut, who's not made the trip here, is the young all-rounder Jan Mulder. And I think, again, the decision here is not really shocking, because he hasn't really put in very good performances, right? He was brought into the side as a potential successor to Jacques Kallis. Obviously, Kallis retired in 2013. That left a void in South Africa's batting lineup. They've tried to replace his very broad shoulders. They've sort of struggled in that respect. And Mulder, he's a medium fast bowling all-rounder who can bat, relatively compactly. So he was groomed in mind to cement that spot on the side, and provide some more batting depth, because they are really struggling to score a lot of runs in recent encounters. But if you look at the 11 tests that he's played in, I know he's played on some difficult wickets, but he's failed to score even 50, even once, right? And he's had, honestly, a tail-ender's average of 14 in the process. So he's not really done much with the bat of note at all. And even though he's averaging 26 with the ball, if you actually break those statistics down and you actually look series by series, you'll notice that he's only taken one wicket against the stronger test teams that he's played against, that being Pakistan, India, England, and New Zealand. The wickets that he's taken, the rest of them, have come against what have been very weak batting lineups that West Indies have produced out in the series in the Caribbean that they went to visit them, and the Bangladesh series at home as well. And then there was a bunch of wickets he took against Sri Lanka, who had a better batting lineup, but still had a lot of injuries, and so that has to be taken into account. So they didn't necessarily always have the best batsman there at the time. So you'd have to say that the axing from the squad seems justified, and the other person who I think that it's completely justified for is Duan Olivier, because ever since his return from county cricket, he hasn't looked the same bowler. He's bowling max high to 120s, max maybe the odd ball creeping in at 130, and the claim was that when he came back from county cricket that he had learned how to become a much more resourceful bowler. His issue was that he was often bowling short a lot of the times, bowling quick, I'd say around the 140 mark, and he was really bouncing out and frightening out subcontinental teams. That was the sort of claim to fame that he had. And he went to county cricket, and he lost some pace, but the idea was that he was going to be able to get more movement in the process, and that he learned how to channel and swing the ball in a more measured way. But if you actually see a lot of the matches that he's played in, he hasn't really swung the ball at all, really. And yeah, that combined with the fact that he's bowling in the high 120s and just the nature of his action, he can't really bowl full, because it comes across as fairly harmless. It's made him very innocuous in his return. So again, I think it's a fair decision. I will say not all the changes here have been form related. So you've had the likes of batsmen and Keegan Peterson and Ryan Rickleton that have been injured since their visit to England and such, and as such they miss out from the side. There is one like-for-like inclusion in the side as well that we should mention. Luther Sepamla, who is a young, let's say fast-medium bowler, who's tall. He's been replaced with Lizard Williams. But that inclusions, both players aren't likely to make their debut in the. I mean, they're not likely to play in the series, I should say. But for me at least, the more interesting inclusion on the side is of Gerard Coetzee, and Coetzee is. It's funny, right? Because Coetzee, funny enough, shares in some ways a similar background to the Australian cricketer that I just spent 5 minutes ranting and raving about, Lance Morris. Because both of them were identified as far back as 2019 as having genuine pace that could trouble top order batsmen, and now Coetzee, he's on the South African radar, and he's gotten a place in the squad just like Morris has. Now, Coetzee hasn't quite tasted the success that Morris has at the red ball domestic level. In his 15 games, he averages 32 to Morris's 25. And it's not like the recent numbers have been all that great either. He's played 6 matches in this recent domestic 4-day tournament, and he's gotten 15 wickets that have cost him 37 runs apiece. But there is an important caveat, and there's an important thing to bring up here to provide the requisite context, if you will. And that is, unlike Morris's fate this season, Coetzee, he's had to deal with a lot of surfaces that have been uncharacteristically, I will say, flat and on the slower side. I mean, you've seen batsmen get close to 300s in a 4-day game, right? And one batsman, if I'm not mistaken, to crack to 291. And a lot of the pitches that I saw him bowl in were very much like this. And so those pitches haven't been very helpful to his brand of express pace. And I do mention express pace here because he does tend to rank pretty high up on the speed gun. He's clocked domestically 150 clicks in the past, from my understanding. And when in sync in spells, I've seen him hover in the mid-140s. He's also got a lot more tools in his arsenal than Morris, I would say. You mentioned the skill factor. I think Coetzee has a bit more of nuance and skill and variety, I should say, to his bowling. Because what I've seen from him, he tends to get a pretty decent amount of outswing going away from the right-hander. And unlike Morris, he's actually able to bowl 2 different types of slower balls. I think one of them is a split finger variety, where you hold the ball in the seam and rotate like that. And then the other one is an off-cutter, which is pretty standard, par for the course these days for bowlers into T20 cricket. But I will mention, I say with frequency he's able to bowl those 2 slower balls, because he also can bowl a back-of-the-hand slower ball. And the reason why I don't mention this as frequent is he tends to avoid this, from my understanding, especially in recent times, because he shies away from it because it causes a lot of strain on his shoulder. So he doesn't use it that much, but it is an option that he can turn to if need be. And our listeners might be thinking, well, why is this important, right? Like, why should we care about whether he has 1 variety of a slower ball or 3 varieties of slower ball? Those are mainly reserved for limited overs cricket. And while slower balls in of themselves aren't as valuable perhaps in test matches as in shorter formats, it's still a handy asset in the longer game to have as a fast bowler, because you do need to sometimes deceive opposition batters. One example I can think of is Mitchell-Johnson, when he had that great series in South Africa. When he took that 11 for, one of the wickets he actually took was A.B. de Villiers, who was sort of withstanding that assault and playing brilliantly on 92. He managed to dismiss him with a slower ball.
And also,
beautifully deceived.
Most famously, that boomerang slow ball Yorker to Sean Marsh at the MCG Boxing Day test in the Border Gasco Trophy. I think that's been replayed countless of times. It was like the last ball before lunch. Yeah,
from Boomerang, isn't it? Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot to like about him, and he seems to be a very skillful bowler. I will say, like Morris's situation with Australia, I think Coetzee, he's not going to make the playing 11 for the first test at least, because there's far too many frontline seamers in front of him, and I don't think they'll allow him to claim a first choice spot in the side. And yeah, I mean, again, South Africa just have a wealth of fast bowling at the moment, right? You have Rabada, Nortje, Jansen, Ngidi. They're hard to replace in any side. And actually, speaking of which, let's talk now about the 11s that we think are going to actually play in this test series. Because obviously, squads are designed to have a lot of players in them. Not all of those players are going to actually get opportunities to play in the actual test matches. So without further ado, let's talk about what we think are going to be specifically the 11s that are going to go into this particular series. And I'll start with South Africa here. I think the 11 that I expect to take the field for South Africa at the start of the series, and one that I think they'll largely stick to unless an untoward circumstance happens, is going to be the following. You're going to have the openers, Dean Elgar, Charles Hervier to open the innings. At number 3, I think because of an issue with Keegan Peterson, who was their normal number 3 sitting out for the tour, Rassie van der Dussen is going to van der Dusen, I should say, van der Dusen, is going to be at number 3. Themba Bavuma, the vice captain, I think is going to slot in at 4. Kaya Zondo, who's another young batsman, up and coming, who played a little bit in England as well. I think he'll be at number 5, replacing where Razi was batting. Kyle Verreynne, I should say, Kyle Verreynne, he's going to be the wicketkeeper at 6. Marcojansen, I think, will slot in at 7. Although there is a doubt here. I could very much see them play Thiernis de Bruyne at number. I could see him slot at number 6, and then Verena play at 7, and Marco being axed. But I think they'll go with the protection of an extra bowler in their lineup. So and Marco Jansen, will come on to him a little bit later, but I think he can bat as well, which is going to be crucial in sort of trying to balance the side a little bit. So I think he'll be slotted at number 7. Keshav Maharaj, the 8th person in this playing 11. I think he can also bat a bit, and he's going to be the sole spinner for them. And then the quicks, Kahiso Rabada, Ulrich Norkia, and Lungi Ngidi, I think, are going to be the other 3 members of this lineup. And I think that's what they're going to go in at the Gabba with. But it's interesting because you have some thoughts about the composition of this lineup, and I was curious to get your take on it.
Yeah, I just want to briefly touch up upon their lineup. In terms of their composition, if you have a look at the South Africa's batting lineup, you could say it looks a bit batting light in terms of their depth, because they're pretty much all the specialist batting. It pretty much ends with at number 6, and you would say 7 to 11. That's kind of like becomes more bowling heavy. So you would think that South Africa might need like another extra specialist batter, but I think South Africa, they'll probably stick to their bowling strength and go 4 outright paces plus Maharaj. And given how that Marco Jansen and Maharaj, they're capable lower order bats. It's kind of funny because I saw Maharaj batting during the India series early in the year. I think he was sending as like a night watchman during one of the tests, and he actually looked quite comfortable against the paces compared to a lot of the South African bats. So he's more than enough to like hold it on, capable of holding his end. And I think Marco Jansen is also like a capable lower end bat. I think he scored like a 50 in the England series in the first test, I believe. So I think they're no Chris Martin when it comes to batting, I would say. But you would maybe like think about maybe the idea of maybe dropping like an extra a pacer for another batter, but I don't think so. So yeah, I think
they'll play to their strengths. Yeah, that's what makes me think that they'll go in with the lineup that I mentioned. But in that vein, mate, what's your starting 11 for the first test, but for Australia, the home team?
Warner Khawaja as our openers, minus 3, Smith at 4, Travis Head at 5, Cameron Green at 6, Alex Carey at 7, Pat Cummins at 8, Starc, Lyon, and Scott Boland. I think maybe the only slight change could be like the middle orders, where the Head comes in at 5 or 6, but I think for the most part Head is playing at 5 nowadays. It's a pretty predictable and settled lineup. There's no real surprises barring injuries. I think the real question going into the 11 was who is going to be Australia's third pacer with Hazelwood out. So between Boland and Neser, Boland has been favoured over Neser according to the Australian coach Adrian McDonald because of his phenomenal statistical start to his Test career.
Yeah, I think I saw a stat where the amount of wicket balls that he's bowled, right, and the amount of wickets he's taken are second only to, in the history of Test cricket, to George Lohmann. And if you don't know who George Lohmann is, I don't blame you, because he was a guy who bowled in the 1880s and 1890s, back when the pitches literally were about as uneven as they could come. So
yeah, I think I saw a stat at one point. I'm not sure if it's like outdated now. I think I saw a stat with Boland where his second innings bowling average was like four for Scott Boland, which is a statistical absurdity. I think in regards to Micronesia, he could have also been a good selection for the Gabba, given it's his home ground. He's taken like 77 wickets at a 19.46 average from like 18 first-class games there. But Boland has also like done well over there, taking 27 wickets at 16.7 from 5 games. I think with those Gabba wickets during the Sheffield, it's slightly skewed because they tend to be more green tops and more bowling friendly compared to the Gabba pitches we've seen in the last few years. Although, given the state of the Gabba pitch for this upcoming test, I think it's a little more on the greener side. So I think both Bowler and Nisa, bowling would be like suited to a pitch like that.
Yeah, I mean it makes perfect sense to me why they'd pick him.
Yep.
It's not every day you get a bowler who's averaging 10 in the first couple of matches that he's playing. So yeah, I think all in all, both teams will go in with squads that are pretty sensible. They do have limitations, but I think they'll play to their strengths at hand. Let's move on now to some of the players from both sides we view as vital to their chances out of the squad and out of the predicted 11 that we selected. And let's start with cricketers from the touring side, South Africa. So, although there's plenty I'd like to talk about more in detail, that I'll probably refrain from doing so, otherwise we'll be here for, 8 hours. And, there's so many I want to talk about, right? Keshav Maharaj, he's probably the most notable of the omissions.
I wanted to talk about Marnus and Cameron Green,
but yeah, I'll refrain from doing that now, and I'll stick with discussing two blokes in detail. The first of which is the current vice captain of the team, Temba Bavuma. Now, Bavuma's career, it's not been a stranger to controversy. His place has been a matter of debate as part of the broader conversation about transformational targets, the quota system, etc., really since his debut back in, I think it was 2015, 2014. Could be wrong with the exact date, but he's been a contentious figure within South African cricket, from what I can tell. And it does seem, though, that scrutiny over him warranting a position in the side has amplified in the last year or so. And I think the crux of the issues stem from a disastrous showing as an opener down under in the 2022 T20 World Cup, as well as a rejection of him at the IPL-bought South Africa new T20 league that's been newly launched. He wasn't picked by any of the teams, which was a bit of a shock and scandal in some ways, even though there is an argument that he wasn't a very good T20 player and didn't really deserve that, which I tend to buy. But personally, a lack of form shown in T20s shouldn't be the criteria for dropping a guy or questioning the place of a guy's in a test side. The different formats, the different requirements needed for them. It's not particularly reasonable or fair, I would say. And Bavuma's average over the last 12 tests, so basically since 2020, has been pretty credible. It's 44.44. And even if you look at his overall average, which I think is 34.5, something to that effect, it might be 4.25 actually. It's second highest in the side. And the only one who has a higher average than him is his direct superior and the current captain of the South African team, Elgar. But during this 3-year phase that I mentioned above, of 2020 onwards, Bavuma's never scored a century. And in his entire career, he's only made one overall. And now, I don't want to, cast too many aspersions about the hard effort and work that needs to be put in to make centuries sometimes, but it was on a road. It was a 600 meets 600 kind of a game, right? And that sort of petered down to the draw. And it did happen against England way back in 2016. And so in a lineup where no member has averaged 50 with the bat, where in that lineup, given that they're playing against a side where every member of their top 5 has averaged 40, there is a very critical need for somebody to step up and have a good series. And I wouldn't say just a good series, right? It's one where South Africa need to score a long, protracted, ideally big, even daddy 100. Some talking about scores of 150 and up. And Bavuma, being the senior member on the side, he's desperately going to look towards becoming that man that South Africa can rely on, and by doing that, also protect his spot in the side, which I think it's fair to say he's earned over the last 2 years, but will come under threat, especially if he doesn't have a good campaign this time around. So that's the stakes for him. On a less, I don't want to say existential, but essentially on a less, somewhat perhaps a little bit less serious in terms of career-ending prospects or position in the side ending prospects, I want to turn my attention now to the second pick that I've chosen to sort of analyze as one of the key players in this tour, and somebody who I think is going to be crucial for them. And it's a 22-year-old who's only played 7 tests so far, by the name of marcojansen. Now, marcojansen's never bowled in a test in Australia before, and it's perhaps reasonable to assume from some that he's too inexperienced to meaningfully perhaps make a mark on this tour in the international in this tour, or in general. It might have been reasonable for someone to assume before he made his debut that he wouldn't have really made a mark on the international scene. But he's also taken 37 wickets in international cricket since his debut, and they've come at an average of basically once in every 5.5 overs. And it's not like he's been a mug with the bat either. We mentioned it earlier, but he's averaged, I think, 22 with the bat, which is, that's pretty solid for somebody who's a bowler first and foremost. And I think regarding his role as a bowler, I think his role with the ball in particular is going to be very essential for South Africa, because he's probably the best exponent of swinging the brand new kookaburra up front. And even though Jansen so far in his short international career averages significantly higher against left-handers versus right-handers, the stats show that he averages 29 against left-handers versus right-handers, who he averages 16 against. But he's also not played against that many left-handed batsmen, to be honest, and for me it's more about at this stage the potential here, and he has the ability to move the ball away from the left-hander, which brings in more modes of dismissal when you're able to get the ball to move away generally from a batter. It makes the straighter one a little bit more deadly as well, and so I think that ability to move it away from the left-hander will induce chances of more dismissals potentially against especially the opening pair that Australia have for this series, that being David Warner and Usman Khawaja. So I think South Africa will likely gravitate towards using him up front to try to get rid of those two batsmen in particular. And that's going to be really crucial for them, because Usman, he's been having a pretty protracted purple patch since re-entry to the test side. I mean, when you score over 1,000 runs in 9 tests at an average of 82, and do that in different countries and on different pitches in different conditions as well. In Sri Lanka, he made a score of note against on a surface that was toning a bit. In obviously Pakistani cashed in on some flat wickets. In Sydney against England, he scored against what was a slightly bouncier wicket there than usual. So he's been making runs in all different sorts of circumstances at large. He's in the form of his life. It's fair to say that. And I think South Africa will need to nip him out early if they want to have a shot winning the series, and win most of the matches. And as for Jansen himself, the bounce that he generates from his 6'7" wiry, 6'7" wiry frame and high release point is rather considerable. Allied to a naturally fullish length, he, in theory, might be perfectly suited to a lot of the anticipated conditions here during the series. In many ways, actually, he reminds me in terms of action and skill set. He sort of bears a resemblance to one of Australia's greatest fast-bowling talents of a prior generation, Bruce Reid. Now, Icarus, I don't know if you've seen footage of Bruce Reid bowl. He's probably a little bit before your time. I think it's safe to assume around, I'm talking late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah, long before I was born.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but there's a lot of footage out there. Some at ball by ball, and he was a very impressive bowler. I mean, he averaged 24 overall, and in Australia he averaged just a tick over 20. And given that he was, he took 100 wickets overall, it's a pretty good achievement. And yeah, given the fact that I'm comparing Jansen to Bruce Reed, that's very high praise. But there are two things that I think he will struggle potentially on this tour that I think he needs to address. It hasn't been an issue for him so far, because he's bowled pretty well and consistently, but also because the wickets have been very helpful. But say on an SCG wicket, which is not so helpful, then there could be a couple of issues that he runs into. And the first of those actually has to do with his ability to sustain pace over long spells. Because I've noticed at times earlier in his test career, in the matches that I've watched, that his pace can drop considerably from where he generally bowls, which I would say in the high 130s, to and sometimes touching the 140s, the low 140s, at the start of an innings, to a low 130s by the end of a match or by the end of a long spell. And so, you want to be able to ideally sustain pace or have not too much of a significant drop in pace. And come day 3s to day 5 in Sydney, or at the end of the test match at the Gabba, it could be something that could affect him. And so I think one of the things that he can do to improve on that and make sure that he isn't losing some pace as he goes on actually has to do with two biomechanical factors in his bowling. One related to his front knee and one related to his lead arm, or as you could more straightforwardly say, his non-bowling arm when he's delivering the ball. Because his front leg is not braced at the point of impact. And biomechanical studies that I've seen, one of the things that they almost unanimously agree with is that a bowler generally can extract some additional pace and generate, I should say, more extra pace if they are able to brace their front leg, and that is to say, keep it relatively straight, so to speak. And he doesn't quite do that, and so I think if he did that, he would gain a little bit in terms of pace, because it would provide him a break and it would help him with his momentum, to transfer through the crease and so forth. And then the other thing I would say is that in regards to his non-bowling arm, the path of its motion is largely self-contained in a circular path that's fairly narrow. When he started out, it was much smaller. It's gotten a little bit better since, but while this in and of itself I don't think is necessarily a problem, his bowling arm, it doesn't really extend very high or far before he brings down the ball. Even if you look at somebody like a Mohammad Siraj, for example, or you look at some other people that are fast bowlers bowling today, they'll often take their bowling arm and stretch it, non-bowling arm, the lead arm, they'll stretch it, a little bit further away from them and also higher above their head than Jansen does. And the reason why they do that is if you have a long delivery stride, which Jansen does, the lead non-bowling arm, it sort of creates, like, combined with the leg, it creates sort of like a lever mechanism, and it allows you to, like, propel the ball down at a slightly faster pace if you exploit that mechanism well. And that factor, for reference, is present in Bruce Reed's bowling. So given the similarity otherwise in actions, I think if Jansen could work on these parts of his bowling action just a little bit more, I think he could do a better job of maintaining that pace and hostility throughout. And it's very useful for him to have that bit of added pace already because he's tall, so he doesn't have to pitch the short ball as necessarily as bang it as down the wicket, halfway down the wicket to get it at the throat or the neck or the eyes of the batsman. But the other thing is, it may help him also with his tendency at times where he likes to bowl bounces. He's done that in a couple of matches. In what I would say, he's resorted to them in quite a few test matches, bumper barrages. And I remember, for example, him ending up resorting to bowl a succession of short pitch deliveries in South Africa series at home versus India in the second test, and then their tour away to New Zealand in the second match. And although his strategy at aiming at the batsman's chest and throat was a success against New Zealand. They were, behind the 8 ball in that match. They were looking to draw, and he was able to, along with Rabada, sort of force the victory to draw the series 1-1, and they did this in the second test of that series. That the ploy to bounce out India's low order batsman on a wicket that was doing plenty from a length, where he just had to plop it on a length and it would have probably gotten a lot of the tailenders out. It wasn't very effectual, and it could have cost South Africa that match. Elgar in the end made that brilliant 96, and they won it, you would say comfortably by the end of it. But he did probably give away 20-30 runs in what was a low-scoring match with that strategy. So I think the other thing really that he needs to work on, right, is developing that sort of bowling strategy of knowing when do you want to deliver the bouncer. And so I think he needs to be a little bit more discriminate in when he chooses to adopt that strategy. And he also sometimes, I think, needs to choose the right angles. Now, he's done this before, so it's not like he hasn't bowled from this, angle or delivered the short pitch balls from this angle before. But I think, in general, he should stick to coming around the wicket and bowling it in the ribs of the right-hander. And that, I think, will make the right-handed batsman more susceptible of getting out, because it's usually harder to get out of the way from the ball. So if there's any inconsistency in bounce, that the angle is such where they would have to play at it. And if they play at it, the chances of getting caught out from the hook and all those sort of things go much higher. Also getting an edge that goes to like a short leg or that sort of a thing. So I think that's something that he can be a little bit more. He can develop the nuances more of knowing when to bowl that way in an innings, and that could be very handy for him in the series as well. So that's my perspective on some of the members of the touring party that I think will hold significance during the series. But mate, Icarus, what do you think? Who are the players that you think Australia will find critical for their chances to win the series?
Okay, so I think one of Australia's key cricketers. I think I'll start off. I think it's a pretty predictable name. I'll start with David Warner. I mean, there's been a lot of talks about him as an Asian opener. He's in poor form. There's looming talks about his retirement. Since his home series against New Zealand, the 2019-2020 series, he's only averaged 28.12 across 25 innings in Test cricket. So that's a pretty lengthy sample size of his poor form. So you would think there are question marks about his place in the side as Australia's first choice opener at this point, even though there's been recent defence and support from the Australian coach, from Khawaja and from Smith. Another key aspect is that with Warner, he's historically enjoyed batting against like these fast bowling and bouncy conditions and in opposition like South Africa. But I think there are question marks against high pace. Well, this South Africa pace bowling attack at this point of his late career, given like the fading reflexes and his hand-eye coordination, kind of like attributing to his like current lean patch, alongside with his like scrambled and undecisive like foot movement. I think already during the last South Africa's Test series, like the Sandpaper series, Warner's been dismissed by Rabada 4 times. He's only averaged 24.8 against him. So that's a key matchup right there to look forward to when it comes for deciding our chances for the series. And also historically,
and to that point, right? I think. And to that point, actually, I was going to mention, it might be even more difficult for him to face off Rabada in this series because the pitches are going to be a bit more helpful to him.
Speaking of the pitches, I mean, with Warner, he's historically has like a strong preference in batting the more like batting friendly tracks when there's not much swing and seam movement on offer, and when the bounce is true. So. And given how the pitches in Australia in recent years have become more bowling friendly, it's going to be like a big test for Warner to see how he can carry himself with the bat in contrast to his like home dominance when the pitches are more flatter or when like the pitches are like roads. And also with the recent opposition over the years, that they have been having success against Warner going around the wicket with the angle of the ball coming in, kind of also aided by the swing, and then the ball seaming out, which Warner like kind of struggles to cover that line, and that's kind of most famously been seen from Stuart Broad in the 2019 Ashes, and also kind of similar with Shaheen Afridi in Pakistan, and as well as Kasan Rajita in Sri Lanka this year as well. So I think overall Warner, he's a key deciding factor for Australia for this series. Another name, another non-surprising name is Steve Smith.
Yeah, I'm about to say these are very obscure names that you're bringing out here.
Yeah, so in regards to Steve Smith, he actually has a relatively modest record against South Africa compared to other countries, and his overall legendary record, he quote unquote only averages 41.53 in contrast to his 60 to 61 career average. I think the biggest talking point and key is how will Steve Smith's new technique will fare against his South Africa bowling attack. And because he's essentially gone back to his early years, like around the 2013 Ashes to 2014 South Africa series period, where he's kind of not shuffling as much. He's kind of staying more still at the crease. There's a lack of exaggerated back and across movement across the stumps. He's staying a bit more side on, less front on. He's kind of open, less opening his stance up. So Smith actually had a very good series in 2014 South Africa with that batting technique at the time. So I think it's kind of interesting to ponder whether is he attempting to replicate that success in contrast to the one he's adopted for the last 8 years, because I think during the 2014 South Africa series, I think far and away the best batter that series was David Warner, but I think right behind him was Steve Smith as well. I think he averaged like over 50 or 60 that series.
Yeah, he did have a very good series.
Yeah. And I think another thing is, I think like the doubters and the critics of Steve Smith's technique over the years has been over its sustainability long term, and it's kind of how it's kind of relied a lot on his hand-eye coordination, and when that goes away, it kind of like results in like a possible steep batting decline in his later career. I think it's kind of interesting to consider whether this technique change at this point of career was like a good timing or like the right move. I mean, because Smith is currently 33, and that's usually considered to be like kind of like the final days of like a batter's prime, and it's kind of like crosses into kind of like a dangerous cross section into like a decline, or like quote unquote the wrong side of 30s. And I think also Smith has recently said in a paper where he mentioned how that a couple of the ways that he got out against the South Africa bowling attack, he squared himself up a bit on the back foot and caught behind a couple of times from their bouncier bowlers. He mentioned how guys like Rabada and marcojansen, who are quite tall, get extra bounce. So he's kind of hoping where staying a bit more side on will kind of helps him, leave the ball better and get to better positions. And I think relating to what Smith said, when I was watching the 2018 South Africa series, especially during the third test, I think he was dirtily being squared up and been dismissed several times by the tall bouncy bowler of Morne Morkel. I think another key thing to note is whether Smith's change in technique kind of like might actually result in being more vulnerable in nicking off driving balls that's kind of like fuller and a little wider outside off stump, because Smith has mentioned before that he decided to change his technique to shuffle ball like during the 2013 Ashes in Perth. He said that nicking off was something that he was more prone to do. It kind of led his downfall in dismissals. So it's kind of interesting to consider whether this new technique will help him better, because he actually mentioned his change in technique will give him better access to his offside stroke play game. I think a key matchup with Smith in this series is Kagiso Rabada. Rabada has a good record against Smith. He's dismissed him 3 times and kind of averages only 26 against him. And regarding Rabada, he's actually one of the very few players that's been able to trap Smith LBW by attacking the stumps and pads with kind of that shuffling technique. I think that
Yeah,
they
I,
haven't
I
do
remember
that.
I remember the 2018 series, right? The second test.
Yeah,
He did that.
yeah. During the second test, the dismissal where it led to that Rabada celebration, the kind of that bump.
Yeah, the
Uh,
barge, the bump.
yeah, yeah. And having seen Smith bad for all these years, if I recall, I think Rabada is actually the last pacer in Test cricket that's able to get Smith nicking off driving kind of relatively early in his innings, and that was back in the 2016 Perth Test in the second innings. Um, so I think overall he's actually like a key player against one of the South Africa's leading bowling spearheads, which is Rabada. And another key matchup is Maharaj. Maharaj actually has a good record against Smith. I think this is kind of like a continuing trend of Smith's possible like struggles against left arm orthodox spin. So kind of like other orthodox bowlers that had success against him, kind of like Heroff, Jadeja. Um, his Maharaj just dismissed Smith like 3 times, and the average is only 26.3 against him, twice in the 2018 series in 3 tests. And so I think with Smith, I think the challenge for Smith against South Africa attack might not actually be the fast bowling, which is like what the ladders, which the hype and focus is surrounding upon the series. It might actually be spin. So I think that's another key thing to note. Whether the Maharaj matchup is something you shouldn't we shouldn't overlook on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you make, because what people might not recall is that Maharaj's debut series actually came in 2016, Australia. That was the first time he debuted, and even though the stats will tell you that he didn't really, he wasn't very penetrative, he didn't take many wickets. I remember bowled distinctly well enough in that series, holding up an end and all, and he left a very positive impression on the commentators and just a lot of the general public as being a spinner of higher quality that they'd seen for a while from South Africa. So it's worth mentioning that, because he has the skill set to trouble him as a quality spinner.
Yeah, and I think the last key player that we'll talk about in terms of being the decisive factor for the series is Mitchell Starc. With Mitchell Starc, I think his bowling performances have a noticeable contrast in output among countries that can and can't handle the pace and bounce in Australia. Starc has been strong against countries like Sri Lanka, New Zealand, Pakistan, and England. Sri Lanka and Pakistan, they're the subcontinent countries where pitches are typically more on the lower and slower side of things, and more emphasis on spin. With England and New Zealand, their pitches are less conducive to pace and bounce, more emphasis on seam and swing. And Starc is noticeably weaker against South Africa and India's, and because they have batters that are kind of like equipped against like the pace and bouncy pitches, and they actually have the back foot game to handle alongside with it. I think with Starc's bowling, he's actually struggled against teams and batters that can like handle his like raw high pace, and they can take advantage of his like over aggressive kind of like wayward lack of control one-dimensional lines and length, where Starc is typically looking to only bowl full and wide to get them nick off driving, or is mainly aims to bowl full at the pads for an LBW bowl. So, and that's mostly outside of with the new ball. So I think Starc has kind of been over reliant on swing rather than seam bowling. And furthermore, his bowling performances also has strong contrast between traditional red ball and day-night pink ball. Starc averages only 18.16 with the pink ball, taking 61 wickets in 21 innings. And comparing to his red ball averages, his red ball averages are 29.84 with 255 wickets in 119 innings. So there's a big contrast in bowling production right there. So considering there are no day-night testers to be featured this South Africa series, I think Starc's potency in the test venue schedule have been reduced as a result. I think Stark has also been like a major exponent of like the reverse swing in the past, but obviously kind of like that aspect has come under scrutiny from the Sandpaper Gate, and because of this, I think Stark's effectiveness with the old ball, like outside of the new ball, it kind of further weakens. I think since the 2018 South Africa series, Stark has only averaged 34.46 in red ball matches against like actual good batting opposition, home and away. So I think overall, based on those three factors are listed above, such as like the opposition, the traditional versus day-night test conditions, and the kind of reverse swing, I think Stark becomes like a key bowler and design factor for the series because it's going to be like a test on whether or not Stark can like overcome his limitations, and he's kind of like, I guess, being considered like a bit of like a weaker link in the bowling attack, and I think that's something South Africa batting could take advantage of. I think one interesting thing to know is that I came across this 2020 CricViz graph, and I actually found out that Stark actually gets more seam movement than Cummins at Hazelwood. So that means that therefore I think Stark actually has like the ability to become more of a good length seam bowler rather than just a full swing bowler. Because when I was watching the Ashes last year, I felt that Stark seemed more threatening when he's just bowling channel length. It doesn't try too hard when pitching the ball up and searching for the swing. I think he should just let his natural advantages of being like the fastest bowler in the side and that kind of left arm angle to do the rest of the work. So I think in addition, I think Stark has recently adopted that kind of like the wobble seam, which is kind of like a very important part of the test bowling metagame since 2018, based from last year's Ashes, and he kind of learned that and picked it up from his fellow seam bowling teammates, Pat Cummins and Hazelwood. So I think this gives further reasons for Stark to kind of like reinvent his bowling strategy outside of new ball swing against a team like South Africa and India when he can't just rely on his raw pace and over aggressive bowling like to get the batters out. I would say.
Yeah, and it's funny that we ended up. I was just gonna say it's funny that we ended up picking both two left arm, fairly fast pacers as our sort of players to watch out for in the series. But I do think they're both gonna have very significant effect on what is the outcome for the series. And yeah, I mean, a lot of exciting things to watch regarding them. Bavuma, Smith, Warner, and a couple others as well. So we're on finally to what I think is probably the most fun part of our preview here. Predictions. We can run roughshod with our imagination and think all sorts of things and say all sorts of things and it's a really fun time generally doing these for series previews. So I'm happy to do it. And yeah, let's look at our crystal ball and intuit what we perceive is going to happen in the future. So I'm actually going to start with you, Icarus.
Oh boy.
Yeah. What is your prediction for this series?
Well, I guess I think I'm a bit more on the pessimistic side. I think a lot of people have Australia as like favorites coming ahead of the series. I don't know if it's just me. Maybe it's part of my ingrained childhood trauma growing up, seeing us lose 3 consecutive home series against South Africa like that. I think my series prediction is going to be 1-1 for the result.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's going to be 1-1. I think mainly because I think a lot of people focus a lot on South Africa's batting inexperience and issues, but I think Australia has like a fair share of like weak links in their team, which I think some people kind of overlook, and I think those weak links might like sway into the series being actually very competitive, in my opinion, more than what people would assume. So I think I think the reason my prediction is like 1-1 because I think in regards to Australia's weaklings, I think for me, from my perspective, I think there's a bit of question marks on Australia's top order against like a high quality pace and bowling attack. I think our middle order is still a bit inexperienced of Green and Carey at like international level, and given how they haven't spent much time on this crease so far this summer, I think they might be coming into this series be a bit undercooked and kind of lacking a bit of match rhythm as well. And I think in regards to Australia's bowling attack, given their hype and reputation, I actually feel there's a bit of chinks in the armor when it comes for their bowling attack, dealing with like adversity when batters are actually adept and familiar with pace and bounce conditions. Like historically, you can see that with South Africa in the 21st century and India nowadays as well. So specifically with South Africa in like 2008, 2012, 2016, and with India with 2003, 2007, 2018, and 2021 series. Like all those series have been the case since the 21st century of Australia's bowling attack kind of like struggling to deal with those type of like adept pace and bounce batters. And also, I think another key thing is I think Australia kind of also has to deal with the adversity of just in general bowling teams out in the fourth innings. I think that kind of recent trend has been happening. Like,
I'm actually going to say to that point, the most obvious case of that's probably the Headingley.
Yeah, the Ashes 2019 Headingley, the Border Gavaskar Trophy at the SCG in Gabba, the 2021 Ashes in SCG, as well as the Pakistan series in the Karachi second test. And I think another thing I'm not going to overlook is probably the psychological pressure and possible disadvantage against South Africa as a result of like the sandpaper gate. Just coming ahead into the series, kind of ordered that kind of like the background noise, kind of possibly affecting our team in the dressing room. There's also kind of still a bit of an uncertainty of Pat Cummins' captaincy and kind of his leadership reign, given how he's still kind of early into his captaincy years, and also his workload as well as a result of that. And linking back to the kind of like the background noise that might affect us. It's kind of like the recent Warner allegations and kind of like the media buzz surrounding his leadership ban, and of course our the sandpaper gate, our like the ball tampering that could like obviously like derail our dressing room morale and kind of reopen the wounds and trauma from all of Australia cricket suffered from that sandpaper gate. So I think all those factors add up. I think the series might be really competitive as a result.
Yeah. I mean, fair. I think you make some pretty fair points. I'm actually gonna go and be a little bit more on the controversial side than probably you were in terms of my series result that I'm predicting. Yeah. I actually think South Africa are gonna beat Australia 2-1.
Okay.
Which I know is 2-1. Yeah. I think that might be a little bit crazy for some, given how South Africa's batting lineup has been pretty weak for the most part. But I would say that the batting lineup is weaker, significantly so, but they do have the slightly better bowling lineup, and it's a bowling lineup critically that, and critically it has more bases covered, right? In terms of the dimensionality that different bowlers are bringing to the attack, right? So you have a left-arm spinner who can turn it away from the right-handed batsman. You have a bowling lineup that's more capable of exploiting inconsistency and bounce with the higher release points on average, I would say. So there are factors like that where I think, especially if there's any variability in bounce on the surfaces and so forth, the Safa Quicks and their spinner could hoist Australia on their own petard of preparing bowler-friendly pitches, right? Another prediction that I have in my mind is that Elgar and Urbi, if they can survive the new ball, I think that they'll put on decent opening stands. So I think throughout the series they'll probably put up 2 75-run plus stands, because I think they have the back foot game to cut and pull in the conditions to score. where, you know, you're for the wickets that we're expecting in the series, we're going to expect them to have a bit more higher bounce than normal, you know, standard normal wicket, if you were to define it in that way. And the movement might be lesser specifically at the SCG. So I think they could do well on that particular ground as well. Now, in terms of runs and wickets, right? I was going to actually ask you who you thought was going to be the leading, you know, the leading run scorer and the wicket taker for Australia. Because in my book for South Africa, actually, I'm going to go with Rassie van der Dussen. I think he's been coming in with pretty good form. He scored that 50 in the tour game, and I see him as having probably the best defensive technique, despite being a newcomer to the side, have the best defensive technique within the lineup, and he's somebody who I think often isn't. His average is low because he had to play on a lot of bowler-friendly surfaces. But he's, you know, in that India series, for example, he scored 240s. They weren't many runs, admittedly, but he has an ability to stick resolutely when a lot of wickets are falling out away from him, and I think it has to do with the fact that he's a senior player at this point on the domestic side. He's been in those situations. I think the experience helps him out a little bit, and he's got an iron resolve in a way, which translates into his defensive technique, or that is reflected also technically in his defensive technique, I should say. So I think he'll score the most amount of runs for them, and for South Africa, I think the most amount of wickets will be taken by Kagiso Rabada. Because I think it's more, in this case, I do think, normally I think it's a bit of a misnomer when people say that experience is the end-all be-all, or more, you should pick a player because he's more experienced in those conditions. But I think with KG, he has the most amount of experience within this bowling lineup bowling here that I think is going to be valuable in terms of hitting the right lengths. And I think that with his rejuvenated form, starting from really the second the innings against India in that home series, he's gone up a notch in pace in general. He's looked a bit better, just not quite going through the motions as much. Obviously, he must have been trying, but he seemed a little bit exhausted. He got a little bit of a break. He looked very, very good in England as well. And the other factor that I think a lot of people might not be looking at is that he can reverse the ball better than most of the South African pacers in the lineup, and that could come handy at the SCG or the Gabba once the wicket starts to dry out. So I think he could, and he also, because of that experience, probably knows how to maintain the shape of the ball, you know, how to hide the ball when it's reversing and he can reverse in both directions. So I think that those factors will be very helpful for him becoming the leading wicket taker for South Africa in the series. On your end, who are you going for? Really quickly.
I think my leading run scorer might be a bit surprised, but it's not surprised given the fact that it actually happened last year. I'm actually going to go with Travis Head again as the leading run scorer. I think Travis Head's natural game, with his kind of natural stroke play and aggression with his shots, I think that might provide value against bowlers like a Rabada and Nokia, who can be often at times be a bit expensive searching for wickets. And I think Travis Head's stroke play game could certainly take advantage of that. And I think because given the design factors between Australian South African bowling attacks, I think the top order will most likely struggle more to get the bulk of the runs. I think someone like Travis Head can definitely take advantage when the ball goes older and softer. I think those are the easier times to get yourself in and bat. So I will go with Travis Head again, and also the fact that it was kind of impressive how well Travis Head's batted on the Hobart game last year on kind of like a green top, where again his counter-attacking game, which seems to have worked for him from the start of last summer. I feel like South Africa's pace and the kind of aggression, I feel like that kind of fades off, or actually helps Head's game more with that counter attack.
Fair enough.
In terms of most wickets, Um, I'm actually not. I'm actually thinking it might not be an Australian bowler because given the bowling workload and how Australia has kind of emphasized more on bowling rotations, I think like some of the bowlers, like I don't know, maybe like a Cummins or Starc, they might get rotated out maybe in between tests, and so they might not get an opportunity to rack up the wickets tally. So I'll probably go with like a maybe like a South African bowler.
I just want to mention here, out of the Australian bowlers, who would you be more? Who would you think would be most likely to take the most amount of wickets?
I think I'll probably go with like probably I don't know, it's a safe pick, but I'll probably go with like Pat Cummins, because I can see Bolden being rotated out at certain points. I mean,
yeah, Cummins is a captain, right? So he probably won't be rotated out. So
well, unless Bolden takes another sixth again at the MCG, then. But I think Cummins might be like the safe choice here. So yeah.
Fair enough. And with that said, I think it's time we sign off. I want to thank you, Icarus, for joining me on this episode.
Yep, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to be featured.
It's a pleasure of mine. You seem to be a very insightful person, and it was nice to have you on. And yeah, for all our listeners, stay tuned. We've got a lot more interesting content coming out, a lot of interesting series that we're going to be perhaps reviewing. Past cricketers we're going to examine a little bit more in detail. So there's a lot in store. Do feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share this podcast with others. And yeah, till next time. See you. Bye.
Bye.